Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be taking a fairly extensive look at 24 different samples of watercolor paper. Now I've acquired these sheets of watercolor paper from a variety of sources, including the stock that I already had here, some samples that I got from Jackson's, and some papers that patrons have sent me over the last couple of months. I've been stockpiling them, and here I am just sorting them so that we can try and get some kind of rhyme or reason to this video, because it is a lot to kind of tackle. Now, unfortunately, this isn't going to be every single type of paper or every brand that is available. For instance, I really wanted to get the Saunders Bockingford watercolor sample packet from Jackson's. It's a pretty popular set that I've seen a lot of other people review, but they were out at the time that I ordered my samples, so that's not included here. And of course, there's always going to be new options left and right and things that I don't include here. So I hope that some of the papers that you have been wanting to look at are in this video. Otherwise, I do apologize, but I did try my best. I have personally been so excited and anxious to record this video because I want to see all these different papers. I've had this pile building up for the last month or two of all these different samples coming in, and I've just been so excited to see the different options that are out there. I have been using Arches or Arche paper, 140-pound cold press, for pretty much everything since I started watercolor painting several years ago, anything in a professional setting. I do use Canson XL and Canson Montval here on the channel so that I don't go bankrupt trying to create these videos, as Arches is a bit more expensive, but as we will see in this video, there are more expensive options out there, at least here in the US, for the options that we have. Now, another reason that I'm so excited to create this video is that I truly wholeheartedly believe that if you are going to spend money anywhere in watercolors, that it should be on your paper. If you're a beginner watching this video, the quality of the paper that you use is more important than the paintbrushes or the paints themselves. In this video, I'm going to be using Cotman watercolors, which is a student grade. They're straight out of the tube, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But as we will see throughout this video, the quality of the paper and whether or not it's made from wood pulp or cotton rag is going to affect the way that you are able to paint on it. And even though the cheaper papers are more accessible for beginners, they will cause so many more headaches. And even when I'm using the Canson XL and Canson Montval here on the channel, they are so much harder to work with. So if you can afford to invest in anything when you're first starting off with watercolors, make it your paper, and let's go ahead and find out why. As I mentioned, we are going to be using Cotman watercolors today. Now, the reason that I use them straight out of the tube in this separate palette is that I wanted this comparison to be as fair and even and, I don't know, scientific as possible, where I try to minimize the variance as much as I could. So I mixed up these large washes of color that I would be using throughout my testing. The first little compartment on the left there of the red is a very dilute mixture that I'm going to be using to do a more diluted wash. The second red compartment is a much thicker version that I'm going to use in a more concentrated stroke. Then I also have some containers of raw sienna, ultramarine, and then the two mixed together to make a muted green, and that's going to be used to paint a little landscape on each of the swatches. By having these mixed up in advance across all the different boards, I would make sure that the swatches that you will see at the end of this are as even as possible. I'm going to be using two different brushes for this video as well. A 1/2-inch Grumbacher is the main brush that I'm going to be using. It's just a 1/2-inch flat wash. Any brand will do. And then also this little teeny tiny, it's marked as a size 4 flat, but it's, I don't know, it's just a tiny little flat brush. We're going to be doing several tests on each of these swatch papers. Starting off, I'm going to take my 1/2-inch Grumbacher and I'm going to dip it once in my container of water and make a little rectangle on my paper with however much water was contained in that one brush load, so that can be as consistent as possible. I'm going to take my smaller brush in my diluted red mixture and do a little squiggle in the middle of that and then leave it alone. I'm not going to touch it at all. Next, I'm going to take my 1/2-inch flat once again, dip it in that diluted mixture, wipe it off on the edge, and then do a single stroke. Hopefully this first one, I had messed up a little bit, but I try and keep them as even as I can with one stroke going down the paper. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my really concentrated mixture with more intensity. That's going to become more important when we move out of the hot press and onto the cold press and rough textures so that we can see the texture of the paper underneath. Then I'm also going to take the brush and at an angle draw some dry-ish type paint on the dry paper so you can see that texture as well. Now I'm going to be going through and doing these on as many of the pages as I can, and I ended up going with 2 or 3 at a time so that I wouldn't have to rinse out my brushes as often. But every single time I was doing a new page, I would dip the brush in the water, make sure I had the same amount of water. When I went to dip the paint in, it had the same amount of paint. And then I'm also going to be doing these tiny little mini landscapes on each page using the raw sienna, ultramarine, and the green mixed between the two. And the landscapes aren't going to be completely perfect for each and every one, but I did try and do them as similarly as I could so that we could see the flow into the paint, how it reacted with the paper, what happened when you touch the wet to wet, and areas that were, not touching and whatnot. I repeated this with all 24 pieces of paper, and instead of having you watch the entirety of this, it took, I think, 2 hours in total to film all the content for this video. We're going to go ahead and skip forward to the next little section. So after I did my little red swatches and our landscapes, I did want to do a granulation test as well. So I got out my transparent brown oxide from Daniel Smith, which is my most granulating pigment that I own, and I started to mix it up with some water. I wanted this to be a nice loose mixture, as granulation tends to show more when you have more water in a mixture because it separates more from the binder, the pigment settles down into the paper, yada yada yada. Now I'm really glad that I did this test because it ended up being very different on the different types of paper, and I think that's really important to know when you're choosing out your pigments for the type of paper that you are using. To do the granulation test, I'm going to be doing 1 stroke of the dark brown straight out of my little palette, and then I'm going to be doing a 2nd stroke directly next to it, having dipped my brush in the water. So you're going to get the concentrated pigment without rinsing my brush. I'm just dipping it in the water, adding more water so I can kind of see the flow between the more concentrated mixture and it flowing out with the water. I repeated this on all the swatches, and now we can finally take a look at them side by side. Alright everyone, so you just saw me swatching out all of these different watercolor papers, and it's going to be nearly impossible to be able to compare all of these on screen with each other, and so we're going to go through and do a couple of different looks and different groupings. At the end of this video, I will put pictures of each and every swatch card so that you can see them up close and comparatively within their own brands, like between hot press, cold press, rough. But for now, we're going to go through the different types of paper, starting with our lowest quality, not quite watercolor papers. So the lower quality ones that I have that kind of don't fit into another category are the Aqua Bee 90 pounds. This is the lightest weight paper that we have. And then I also have the Bristol 2-ply paper, which is not watercolor paper at all, but I know that some artists do like to use that. So you could see right off the bat that these did warp pretty heavily because they're not equipped to handle all the water that the heavier duty watercolor papers do. There was a lot of bleeding and back runs. You can see both in the little mini landscape as well as in these swatches how they kind of dried unevenly, and the paper did not absorb the water, so these back runs kind of happened. So I did try and find prices to the best of my ability for each of the pieces of paper here, and they are written in the lower hand corners. If I could find a 9x12 piece of paper, I used that for the bulk of the comparisons. I looked first on DicPlick, and if I couldn't find it there, then I found them on Amazon or Jackson's Art, but I tried to find them in places that had reasonable prices for what they were. And if I couldn't find the 9x12, some of them are going to be in sheets and they're marked as per sheet. And then a couple pieces of paper that I have, I couldn't find in 9x12s or in sheets, and so those are in their specialty sizes. So this is 46 cents per 9x6 piece of paper. And the Aqua Bee, even though it's 90 pounds, is 100% cotton, so that is worth noting, versus the Bristol board is definitely going to be paper. So they did warp about the same amount, but if you do want to be practicing on cotton paper, that option is here. Alright, so in our first real little section here, I have our cold press papers, 140 pounds. All of these are equivalent in terms of what they're labeled as. They are mostly, no, I guess it's half and half. So the top row and the fluid paper are 100% cotton, and these three down here are wood pulp papers. So that is definitely reflected in the price. This Fluid 100 actually fits between the Canson Heritage and Moulin de Roy in terms of pricing. However, the piece of paper didn't physically fit there in a nice format, so I moved it down here. We've got the Moulin de Roy at $139 per sheet of 9 by 12. The Canson Heritage is $120. The Arches is 91 cents. We've got the Fluid 100 again that goes right here. That is $124 per 9 by 12. Then we've got Canson Montval. There's a big jump between the cotton and the wood pulp papers. That's down to 50 cents per sheet. The Pentelic Watercolor Journal paper doesn't come in the 9 by 12. In the 7 by 10 size though, it's also 50 cents per sheet. And Canson XL is our cheapest option at 21 cents. So this is what I use for a lot of my YouTube videos and for sketching and things like that, because it is more affordable, and I'm definitely not made out of money in terms of all the paintings that I do on the channel. And actually, it didn't turn out too poorly compared to the other ones. I do find in actual painting I struggle a lot with the Canson XL because it doesn't like to absorb water, and it's usually fighting you kind of along the way. But interestingly enough, in this particular controlled comparison, we've got the Canson Montval, which is a higher quality paper, but I actually like the look of our samples from the Canson XL better. So that's just a kind of way to show you, like, I try to do these all as controlled as possible using the same washes, same amount of water, same type of techniques, but we definitely are going to have a little bit of variation here. When we're comparing the wood pulp papers to the cotton papers, another thing that's noticeable, like our Bristol and our B 90-pound paper, is that we do have more back runs in these cold press watercolor papers, versus we don't have as much of that in the cotton papers, although we do have some back runs here in the Canson Heritage. I think that's about the only place. There was some uneven drying. You could see with our granulating paint here, the water pooled at the bottom and didn't really soak into the paper. It definitely soaked in to the Moulin de Roy, and I really like the texture of this paper. This is not a super easy to acquire paper. I actually had a really hard time finding pricing for it, but I would really like to use more of it because I really like the way that these dried here. Now, the thing that was surprising to me is how insanely different the Arches is in comparison to all of these. Now, Arches is what I use on a regular basis. I love the way it feels, I like the way it handles, but it did some real weird stuff here, again, comparatively to everything else when it came to the granulation aspect. So let me hold this up here so you can see it a little bit better. There were some really, really interesting patterns between the raw sienna and the ultramarine, and then our transparent brown oxide, which, as I mentioned before, I am using this because it's the most granulating pigment that I have. You can see how heavily this granulates on this paper, and I have to assume that that has to do with the sizing and how much water it absorbs, leaving the little pigment particles behind. So if you want a more even look, something like the Moulin de Roy is going to have a much more even tone with the same pigment. And if you really like those granulating textures, if you like those Daniel Smith Primatech paints and you really want to bring that out, then maybe Arches would be the way to go there. So we are still on the same topic of 140-pound cold press paper, but these ones are available per sheet instead of per 9 by 12. Now, some of the papers we already looked at are definitely available in sheets of paper that you can find on art websites, but they are also available in 9 by 12, whereas I couldn't find the pricing for 9 by 12 sheets for these brands of paper, with the exception of the Fluid 100. Now, we already looked at this. This piece of paper came in a little 4x6 pad that one of my patrons sent me, and I also had another patron send me some loose leaf Fluid 100. Now, I was just going to do one of them for the video, but they actually feel different. Like, the texture of the paper feels different. So they're supposed to be the same paper. They're supposed to be Fluid 100, Fluid 100 cold press, 140 pound, but they felt a little bit different, and they also look a little bit different in the swatches. So They're probably just from different batches. They did have similar granulation patterns with the granulation down here, but I just wanted to show you both options in case they happen to be different for some reason, but they're pretty comparable. So we do have the Fluid 100 at, this is the cheapest per sheet option at $4.37 per sheet. Then we have Kilimanjaro, which came to me again in a little 4x6 pad from one of my patrons, but it's also available in full sheets of paper at $4.60 per sheet. This is a brand that I had not heard of before, and it has a really interesting pattern when it comes to the wet on wet look. There was a lot of kind of like the fingerling texture there, and then our washes dried really nice and evenly, and I really like the textures that are available in the little scene. One thing to note is that it did buckle pretty heavily when I did the really wet granulation at the bottom, and it all pooled in the middle, and so you can kind of see that there's a lot more pigment in the center there. Then we have the Strathmore 500 series. I would say that this probably feels most similar to the Arches paper. Out of all the papers that I'm trying new for the first time, this feels the same as the Arches, or not the same, but similar. And it has kind of similar results. I think that these definitely look very similar up here. Not as much of the heavy granulation as we saw in the Arches, but definitely somewhat comparable to that. And then I had the Fabriana Artistico, and it was kind of weird. I know a lot of people really like this paper, and I was really hoping to really love it, and I think it would be fine. I have it in a sketchbook right now, and I think that that's fine for it. One thing to note is that it's incredibly one-sided. The other side is like really smooth. There's no texture on it. And then the top is texture, but it almost feels like a wood pulp paper, like physically. It feels a lot more similar to like a Canson Montval than it does to a cotton paper, even though it is 100% cotton. I did have a lot more bleeding on this paper, so if you like those really wet and wet washes, we had a really big bloom here on the wet and wet swatch. So if you like that style, then this might be a good option. So out of our cold press papers, I went through all of them, looked at them really carefully, and I think that these are my favorite so far based on this particular test. Arches, because I use it all the time, and I'm just really comfortable with it and enjoy it. I don't like this granulation here, but I know a lot of people would. However, I do really like the textures in this little landscape. It's really helpful for me to know this pigment in particular maybe has this interaction with Arches but not other pages, because I was saying like this pigment is way too heavily granulating for me to ever use it in a painting that I enjoy, but seeing it on other papers has been really helpful. But my other favorites, again just based on this series that I definitely will want to look into afterwards, are the Moulin de Roy and the Kilimanjaro. So I really like the textures again. I like the bleed effects of the Kilimanjaro. I think that they have some really interesting textures in this little landscape, and despite the fact that it kind of pooled here, maybe if it were taped it would do a little bit better job of drying really evenly. And then my favorite cheap option, actually, surprisingly, this actually shocked me, was the Canson XL. I thought that I liked the Montval better in painting, and maybe it's just the particular testing that I did, but I do prefer this swatch over the way that the Canson Montval behaved. Alright, next up we have the hot press, and I have 6 samples. All of them are 100% cotton except for the Botanical Ultra Smooth. That is only 50% cotton. And I do not have a super awesome relationship so far with hot press papers. I don't enjoy painting on them. If you know about watercolor papers already, you'll know that hot press is a lot harder to paint on because it shows every single mistake that you make. It is, however, very desirable for portraits and botanical work so that you don't have that added texture that you would with a landscape or, say, an animal portrait like I am more used to doing. I had only used Arches hot pressed up until the point of this video, and so I was excited to try some other options. I never liked hot press from Arches, even though I love their cold press version, and I had heard the same complaint from other people, that they didn't like the way it handled, they didn't like the texture of the paper, that it was too smooth for them to work with, and I have to still keep that. There was a lot of flow on this paper, there was very little control. I felt like some of the other versions did give me better control over where I put my colors, and I'm still just not a huge fan. I'd say the other two that I really don't like in this set, and again it's just my personal preference, is I don't like the Moulin de Roy or the Fluid. If you notice, they both have very, very smooth textures, like the paint just like bled together, and it almost looks, it seems to bring out the fact that I was using my Cotmans for this, if that makes any sense, versus a professional grade. I'm not too worried about using a lower grade paint for these swatch tests, but these two papers really showed that it had more of like a glossy texture, and that there was maybe a little bit more filler or gum arabic in them as opposed to more pigment. So I didn't really like either of these options. I don't have any strong thoughts about the botanical paper. I'm not a botanical painter, so I don't want to make that judgment, but you can decide for yourself. There'll be, again, a picture at the very end for you to take a look at that one. It is high white, so the colors are more vibrant than they are on the other pieces of paper, so that it could be a benefit for you. The Saunders Waterford paper, it's okay. I mean, I think it's better than the Arches or the Moulin de Roy or the Fluid, but my favorite is probably the Canson Heritage in this particular series. So I really like the way that the colors stayed where I put them for the most part. There was some bleeding, but it was textural and interesting still. I have a mostly even wash on this highly pigmented granulating paint there, so this is probably my favorite from the category. In terms of pricing, sorry I forgot to cover that at the beginning, I couldn't find a price for the Botanical Ultra Smooth. Not sure where to find that. I thought I looked everywhere that I would have been, but I couldn't find it. The Saunders Waterford Hot Press is $149 per 9x12 sheet or $7.72 per full sheet. There's a big jump down between the Saunders Waterford and the Fluid 100, which is $437 per sheet. And then, that's the 22x30. And then we have these three are the 9x12 options. So we've got 136, 120, and 91 cents. So I like this mid-range option with the Canson Heritage. I'm going to set this aside so we can take a look at it later. Okay, the last category that we have here is kind of a combination between our thick 300-pound paper and our rough papers, and kind of some crossover in between. We've got two Canson Heritage, one rough, one cold press. We've got a Moulin de Roy and Canson Heritage, both in rough, and then we've got a 300-pound cold press Arches. Now, when I first got my 300-pound cold press Arches, I was really surprised because the texture is not the same as the 140-pound cold press. This feels much, much rougher, and actually we're going to take a look at it in a little bit. It's actually rougher than the Canson rough paper, so that's something to note here. These three come in 9x12 sheets, and the prices are 87 cents, 120, so this is much cheaper than the Canson Heritage. And then we've got our 300-pound paper. There's obviously going to be a jump in price when we go from 140-pound paper to 300-pound paper because it's twice the weight, twice the materials that are being used for it. Our Canson Heritage, which are not in 9x12 sheets like these three are, these ones are in full the 22x30 inches, and they are $16.50 per sheet. If we compare that to our most expensive cold press sheet, the most expensive 140-pound cold press that there was the Fabriano Artistico at $6.09 per sheet. So this is $10 more per page. Now I know I don't have a huge selection of this thick 300-pound paper, but this particular Canson Heritage is definitely very pricey. That being said, it is a beautiful paper. I much prefer the cold press to the rough press. There was some of the skipping on the Arches 300-pound that I mentioned happened in the Moulin de Roy as well, so you can add some texture with dry brushes there. And then there was less of that in the Canson Heritage, although you could certainly dry off your brush even more and get those textures because it is so thick, so absorbent, and you are going to have that where there's going to be a lot less, a lot more water required for moving paint around your paper with these thicker papers that want to soak it all up. When it comes to picking a favorite, it's actually really difficult because all 5 of these papers are really beautiful. I really enjoy each of them. I think the Moulin Rouge is really interesting for the textural properties that it has, and I like both the Arches and the Canson Heritage on kind of either side here with the 300-pound paper. There's a very small difference between, this is $16.50 per sheet, this is $15 per sheet, the Arches, if we were to go sheet instead of a 9x12 price, so they're pretty comparable there. I would have to say that I think that I like the Arches a little bit more just because there is a little bit more texture that you can get out of it, but I also really love the blending here with the different colors, so I don't know, it's a real toss-up for me. Alright everyone, I hope that that was helpful in getting to see all these swatches. Again, I still have the individual pictures for you coming in just a moment, but I wanted to give you kind of my final thoughts on some of my favorite papers from the day. So Canson XL is the cheapest paper that you can buy for watercolor out of the papers that I tested. I do believe that there are still some really big issues with it. I constantly am fighting with it when I'm painting. It doesn't absorb water very well. You have a lot of backruns. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, I do highly recommending investing in your watercolor paper before your other watercolor supplies like brushes or paints, because I think it'll make a bigger difference. But if you just need to do a couple of practice thumbnail sketches or test out some swatches, I mean, it's decent paper for the incredibly low price that it is. That being said, I would always recommend 100% cotton paper because it's just so much easier to work with. Up until this point, I've always worked with Arches Cold Press, was the paper that I used. In this test, I found out some really interesting things about granulation with it and why I did not enjoy this transparent brown oxide from Daniel Smith, because it looks real weird on it, and I think that's again because the water is absorbed into the paper, leaving the pigment behind. So really interesting interaction there. I found that I really enjoy this Canson Heritage hot press paper, which is the only hot press paper that I really kind of enjoy the texture of, that I will definitely try out. And the Moulin Rouge is probably my today's favorite out of the samples, cold press paper. So I'm really excited to try it over the Arches. It is more expensive at the $1.39 per sheet instead of the 91 cents per sheet. But it would be something I'd be interested in trying out for some of my professional paintings. Another contender that I found really interesting in terms of the way that the wet reacted and in the vibrancy of the paints that sit on top of the paper was the Kilimanjaro, so I'd like to try that out as well. The Arches Cold Press and the Canson Heritage were neck and neck are my favorites for the 300-pound paper for different reasons. I like that you have more texture with the Arches if you were going for a landscape or something that you really wanted the texture of the paper to shine through, but the Canson Heritage just had these beautiful wet and wet, really interesting textures here. I loved the way that this dispersed in the wet and wet, and if I can ever afford to spend $16.50 on a sheet of paper, then maybe I can try and try this out. And then the other one that really surprised me, especially based on the fact that I did not like it when it came out of the box, was this Moulin Rouge. I would only recommend this paper if you're not going to have much white space on your paper, because I don't like the way that it looks when it catches the light, when it's just the paper alone, but I really like the way that the pigments sit on top of it and then the way that your brush can kind of skip over to create a really neat texture. That being said, everyone has different favorite watercolor papers. I would love to hear what your favorite watercolor paper is in the comments below, so be sure to let me know. I will have affiliate links for Amazon for some of these different types of papers in the description below, as well as the other papers that I tested that you can find on other sites like Dick Blick, Jerry's Artarama, or Jackson's Art, or any other online retailer. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope that this was helpful. Thank you to those who helped me acquire a lot of the paper samples for this video, and I will see you next time.